I never told my wife that I was the controlling shareholder of her brother's company, a position worth just over $800 million. For 28 years, she knew me only as a retired logistics coordinator who drove a 9-year-old pickup truck and spent his weekends fixing things around our small house in Hamilton. Then one Sunday in October, her brother invited us to his home in Oakville for what he called an important family meeting. Patricia squeezed my hand in the car and told me not to let him talk down to me. She had no idea that the man who owned the building where her brother held his board meetings was sitting right beside her, adjusting the heat because the defroster on the truck had never worked properly. Before I tell you what happened when we walked through that door, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I am always amazed how far a story can travel. The message came on a Thursday morning, the kind of gray October morning that settles over Ontario like a wet blanket and refuses to leave until April. Patricia was at the kitchen table with her tea, reading something on her tablet, and I could tell by the way her shoulders had gone tight that the message was from her brother Gordon. "He only reaches out like this when he wants something," she said without looking up. She set the tablet down and slid it across the table toward me. The message was brief in the way that expensive lawyers are brief. Family meeting, Sunday, 2 o'clock. The house. Bring Patricia. Important matter regarding the estate. Their father, Harold Mercer, had passed away 6 weeks earlier. He had built Mercer Industries from a small Brantford stamping shop into one of the largest private auto parts manufacturers in Ontario, supplying components to assembly plants across Windsor, Oshawa, and across the border into Michigan. Harold had been 79 years old and stubborn until the end. The kind of man who shook hands before contracts and meant it. I had respected him enormously, even though he had spent the better part of 2 decades looking at me the way a person looks at a strange noise coming from their furnace. "Gordon is going to try to cut me out of something," Patricia said flatly. "He's been circling since the funeral." She wasn't wrong. Gordon Mercer was 62 years old and had run Mercer Industries as CEO for the past 11 years, inheriting the chair from Harold in a transition that had always felt more like a coronation than a promotion. He was the kind of man who wore a suit to a backyard barbecue and genuinely believed it made him more impressive rather than less. His wife Sandra collected real estate the way other people collect regrets. And their son, Tyler, had been given a senior role at the company 2 years ago, despite having the instincts of someone who had never been told no. "We'll go," I said. "Robert," Patricia looked at me. "Promise me you won't sit there and let him lecture you." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I told her they would finally see exactly who I was. She smiled at that, a little sadly, the way she smiled sometimes when she thought she understood something she didn't. What Patricia did not know, what I had spent nearly 3 decades not telling her, was that this meeting was not a surprise to me at all. I had been watching it build the way you watch weather coming in off Lake Ontario, slow and inevitable and already decided. 26 years earlier, I had inherited $400,000 from my father. He had been a machinist in Stony Creek his whole life, a man who ate the same lunch every day and never once complained about it. And when he died, he left behind a savings account that shocked everyone, including me. Most people would have bought something with that money. A boat, a trip to somewhere warm. I bought shares in a struggling manufacturer called Mercer Industries. I had spent 8 months studying the company before I touched a dollar of it. Harold Mercer's fundamentals were sound, his contracts were solid, and his balance sheet was only ugly because the early 90s had been brutal for Ontario manufacturing, and the banks had gone cold on anyone with inventory. What Harold needed was patient capital from someone who believed in what he was building. I believed in it. I just never told him it was me. I bought through a numbered company I incorporated in Ontario, 1994. I held that through a family trust, and that trust reported to a holding company I had registered in Alberta called Hartwell Capital Incorporated. The layers were legal, deliberate, and completely invisible from the outside. Harold and Gordon had always assumed Hartwell Capital was an institutional fund out of Calgary. They never asked hard enough to find out otherwise. Within 4 years, I owned 22%. By the time Patricia and I married, I owned 38%. The year Tyler was born, I crossed 51. Today, Hartwell Capital held 54% of Mercer Industries. At current private valuations, that position was worth approximately $830 million. Gordon Mercer worked for me. He just had absolutely no idea. Sunday arrived with the kind of cold that means business. I drove our truck west along the QEW, while Patricia sat quietly beside me watching the lake through the passenger window. We had made this drive before, down into Oakville, where the houses grow wider and the trees are older, and everything is arranged to suggest that money has always lived here and always will. There is a particular kind of silence that neighborhood produces in people who didn't grow up in it, and I had learned over 28 years how to sit inside that silence without letting it mean anything. Gordon's house was on a crescent just far enough from the water to be tasteful about wanting to be closer. 4,000 square feet of board and batten and black-framed windows, the kind of house that showed up in architectural magazines under a headline about understated luxury. Patricia's hand found the center console as I turned in. "They've hired someone," she said quietly. "There's a car I don't recognize." There were 3 vehicles in the driveway that weren't family. I had expected that. Gordon met us at the door. He was dressed the way he always dressed on weekends, which was to say the way most people dress for a job interview. His handshake with me was the handshake he used for tradespeople. Firm enough to establish hierarchy, brief enough to signal he had somewhere else to be. He embraced Patricia warmly and held it a beat too long, the way people do when they're about to do something they've already justified to themselves. Inside, Sandra had arranged the living room with the care of someone staging a property for sale. Chairs placed just so, a coffee service on the sideboard, autumn flowers in a vase that had probably cost more than my truck. She kissed Patricia's cheek and told her she looked wonderful, which Sandra said to everyone regardless of how they looked, because the alternative was having to see them. Tyler was on the couch with his phone. He was 26 now, tall in the way that requires no effort and confident in the way that requires even less. He glanced up when we came in, said hey to his mother and an abbreviated version of the same to me, and went back to his screen. He had been given the title of Director of Strategic Development at Mercer Industries 8 months ago. I had approved that appointment without comment, through the silence of a shareholder who didn't ask questions he already knew the answers to. There were 2 men I didn't recognize seated near the window. One was carrying a leather portfolio and the other had the careful blankness of someone paid to be in the room but not of it. "Robert." Gordon gestured toward an armchair, positioned slightly apart from the main seating, the way you position furniture when you want someone to feel included while making them peripheral. "Please, sit down." We sat. Sandra poured tea. Tyler contributed nothing. Gordon cleared his throat and spoke for several minutes about Harold's legacy, about the responsibility of stewardship, about the importance of keeping Mercer Industries strong in a difficult moment for Canadian manufacturing. He said these things with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed them, and I listened with the patience of someone who had waited 26 years for this particular conversation. Then he got to it. "Patricia, we need to talk about the estate and about the future of the company." He paused. "And I think it's better if we speak candidly." Patricia set down her teacup. "Then speak candidly, Gordon. Dad left you a meaningful share of the estate. His personal holdings, the Muskoka property, some investments. But the company itself, the operating business, that needs to stay consolidated." Gordon's voice was smooth in the way that surfaces are smooth when the roughness has been deliberate sanded away. "We're exploring a significant transaction. There's interest from private equity, possibly a TSX listing. For any of that to work, we need to present a clean ownership structure." Patricia frowned. "What does that have to do with Robert and me?" The man with the leather portfolio opened it without being introduced. Gordon folded his hands. "Your inheritance from Dad will give you a passive interest in the business. That's fine. But an active role for you and Robert in the company's governance going forward, that complicates things. I want to propose a clean separation." He reached toward the coffee table and picked up a document that had been sitting there since before we arrived. He slid it toward Patricia. It was a buyout agreement. Clipped to the front was a check from a corporate account at a Bay Street law firm. The amount was $450,000. "Patricia," Gordon said, "this is fair market value for your inheritance share of the estate assets, excluding the business. You sign this, Robert signs the spousal consent, and you both walk away clean. $450,000. Tax sheltered through a family trust we've already structured." Patricia stared at the check. Her jaw was set in a way I recognized from 28 years of watching her absorb things she had not expected. When she finally looked up, She wasn't looking at Gordon. She was looking at me. It was Tyler who spoke next. He put down his phone and looked at his mother with the certainty of someone who has never had a belief tested by experience. "Mum, it's actually a good deal. You and Dad," he said the last word with a weight that made it mean the opposite. "You've always done things your way. The house in Hamilton, the life you've chosen. That's fine. But this is business. This is the real asset. And frankly, Robert has no background in any of this. Having spousal interests attached to a major transaction is it's messy." Patricia said his name. He shrugged in the way young men shrug when they've decided that caring would cost them something. "I'm being honest. Robert is a great guy. I'm not saying anything about him personally. But come on. He drove a pickup truck for 30 years and called it a plan. And now, because of how the estate shakes out, you're entitled to something that could genuinely shape this company's future? It's not a fit, Mum. Take the money. Let the people who understand this do their jobs." The room was quiet after that. Patricia's face had gone the color of the November sky outside the window. Sandra looked at her cup. The men with the portfolio looked at nothing. I stayed very still. I had learned, in the years of sitting across from Gordon at Christmas dinners and summer gatherings, that stillness unsettled him far more than any argument could. He wanted a reaction. He had scripted against reactions. What he had not scripted against was someone who didn't need the room to go his way. "That's a reasonable offer to consider," I said. "If you'll excuse me for one moment, I need to make a call." Gordon frowned. "What kind of call?" I said the kind that was relevant to this conversation, and I took out my phone. I called Martin Achebe, who had been my corporate solicitor for 24 years, and I put the call on speaker and set the phone on the coffee table between the cheque and the autumn flowers. "Robert," Martin said, "I've been expecting to hear from you today." "Martin," I said, "I'm sitting with the Mercer family. Gordon, his wife, their son Tyler, and two colleagues I haven't been introduced to. Could you describe the current ownership structure of Mercer Industries for the room?" "Of course. Mercer Industries Incorporated is a privately held Ontario corporation with 10 million shares issued and outstanding. The largest single shareholder is Hartwell Capital Incorporated, a federally registered holding company, which holds 5,400,000 shares, representing 54% of the company." Martin's voice was even, unhurried. "The Mercer Family Trust, administered by Gordon Mercer, holds 3,200,000 shares, representing 32%. The remaining 14% is held by various minority investors and employee arrangements." Gordon leaned forward. "I know Hartwell Capital. They're an Alberta fund. They've been a passive investor for decades. What does this have to do with anything?" "Martin," I said, "who is Hartwell Capital?" There was no pause. Hartwell Capital Incorporated is wholly owned by a family trust established in 1994. The beneficiary of that trust and the sole director of Hartwell Capital is Robert Thomas Kerrigan. The room performed several things simultaneously. Sandra's hand went to her mouth. Tyler's phone slid off the cushion beside him, and he didn't notice. Gordon stared at the speakerphone as though it had just told him something in a language he had studied for 30 years and still somehow misunderstood. The man with the leather portfolio, to his credit, simply closed it. "This is not possible," Gordon said. His voice had dropped to something I hadn't heard from him before, something quiet and unmoored. I stood up and walked to the window, giving him a moment. The back garden was bare, the pool covered for winter, the leaves that hadn't been raked yet pressing against the fence in wet piles. 26 years ago," I said without turning around, "your father's company was 6 months from insolvency. The recession had destroyed his credit. The banks had walked away. He was laying off workers he'd known for 15 years, and he couldn't see a way through." Gordon said nothing. I had just inherited $400,000 from my father. I turned to face him. My father was a machinist in Stony Creek who worked the same line for 31 years. He left me everything he had. I could have bought a boat. I bought your father's company instead. Not because I wanted control, because I believed in what he built, and I had the money to help it survive. Gordon's mouth opened and closed. "Every expansion you've announced in the past decade, the Windsor facility, the automated line in Cambridge, the American distribution contracts you signed in 2019, all of it was funded with capital that ultimately traces back to me. Every dividend your family has collected for 26 years came from a position I built quietly with my father's savings. I let that settle. You work for me, Gordon. You've worked for me for longer than Tyler has been alive. You just didn't know who you were working for. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up the check. $450,000. I looked at it for a moment. Martin, I said into the phone, please proceed with the governance review we discussed. Understood, he said. I'll have the initial correspondence to the minority shareholders by Tuesday. Given the 54% position, Hartwell Capital has the right to call a special meeting of shareholders. I'll be recommending that agenda include a review of current executive leadership and compensation structure. There was a short sound from Gordon that might have been the beginning of a word. I set the check back on the table. I never wanted this, I said. I came to this family as Patricia's husband. I asked for nothing except to be seen for who I was. For 28 years, you looked at my truck and my postal code and decided the conversation was already over. You invited me here today to write me a check to make me smaller and go away quietly. And you had Tyler tell his mother that her husband was a man without ambition who had no business being involved in serious things. I looked at Tyler directly. He was 26 years old, and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, his actual age. I don't say any of this to embarrass you. I say it because I want you to understand something. Money doesn't create character. It reveals it. You had an opportunity today to treat a member of your family with dignity. You chose differently. That will matter more than any TSX listing for a very long time. Patricia stood. She hadn't said anything for several minutes, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that reminded me of why I had fallen in love with her. I'd like to go home now, she said. I took her hand and we walked out of the house together. Behind us, I could hear Sandra saying Gordon's name in a low, careful voice, the way you speak to someone who needs to understand the extent of a damage. The drive back to Hamilton was quiet for a long time. Patricia watched the lake again, and I kept both hands on the wheel, and the heater in the truck made its usual sound like a man clearing his throat. How long? She asked finally. Since before we met, I said. I bought in 2 years before Harold introduced us at that fundraiser at Cops Coliseum. I had already owned 8% by the time I asked you for your phone number. She thought about that. You never told me. No. She was quiet again, and I gave her the space for it. There's a kind of quiet in a long marriage that means thinking, and a kind of quiet that means hurting. And after 28 years, I knew which was which. I thought about telling you 100 times, I said. On our wedding day, I almost did, but I kept asking myself the same question. If you knew, would you ever be completely certain that you had married me and not the position? That you had chosen Robert Kerrigan and not Hartwell Capital? She looked at the road ahead. I needed to know that you loved the man who drove a pickup truck and forgot to fix the defroster for 3 winters running. I needed that to be real, because it was the only part of my life I was certain about. Robert, she said softly. I know, I said. She reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift, and we drove the rest of the way home like that. The governance process took several weeks. Martin filed the appropriate notices. The shareholder meeting was called in accordance with the articles, and the vote was conducted with the procedural tidiness that serious money always insists on. Gordon retained a minority position and a reduced advisory role with no executive authority. A new interim CEO, a woman named Carolyn Fitch, who had spent 20 years running supply chain operations for a Tier 1 automotive supplier in Windsor, was appointed by the board with my support. She understood the business better than Gordon ever had, and she had no interest in performing authority, only in exercising it. Gordon did not fight the outcome. I think by the time the meeting happened, something had shifted in him. Some certainty about the order of things had come loose at its moorings, and he was still finding his footing. He came to Carolyn's first all-hands meeting and sat in the second row and listened. I heard later that he asked a question about the Cambridge facility that was genuinely useful. That surprised me more than almost anything else in the whole business. Sandra called Patricia twice in the first week. Patricia let both calls go to voicemail. The third time she answered, and I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and did not try to hear what was being said. Patricia talked for 20 minutes and hung up and stood at the window for a while. She didn't tell me what was said, and I didn't ask. 28 years teaches you which questions to hold. Tyler was harder. He had lost his director title in the restructuring, which was inevitable and appropriate, And for the first 2 weeks afterward, he was apparently calling his father 3 times a day, trying to understand a situation that had been entirely reshuffled by a person he had written off as irrelevant. I had been the punchline of his understanding of the world, and now I was the foundation of it. And that kind of reorganization takes time when you're 26 and have never had to do it before. He sent me a text message 14 days after the meeting. It said, "I owe you an apology. I don't know how to have that conversation yet. But I wanted you to know, I know that." I read it twice, and then I sent back, "When you're ready, I'm here. No rush." He didn't respond right away. I hadn't expected him to. In January, Martin helped us establish the Kerrigan Family Foundation, funded with an initial gift of $60 million from Hartwell Capital. Patricia became its first executive director, which was the right decision for a dozen reasons, and which she herself had come to before I suggested it. The foundation focused on skilled trades education and apprenticeship programs across southern Ontario, the kind of programs that would have given a young machinist's son from Stony Creek different options in a different era. We announced it quietly, through a short press release and a small gathering of people who understood what it was for. There were no speeches. There was coffee from Tim Hortons because Patricia insisted and because she was right. I kept the truck. Patricia made me get the defroster fixed, which was fair. Gordon came to our house in February. He called first and asked if he could come by, and I said yes. And he drove himself in a Camry I didn't recognize, which I later learned he had bought after selling the Lexus. He stood at our front door in a jacket that wasn't a suit jacket, and he looked smaller than he had ever looked in his own house in Oakville, which somehow made me feel better about the evening rather than worse. We sat at the kitchen table and Patricia made tea and then found reasons to be in another room, which was a gift. Gordon held his mug and looked at it. "I've been going over it," he said, "over and over. 26 years. The whole time, I said. He shook his head slowly. "Dad never knew?" "No. Harold thought Hartwell was a pension fund with a long horizon." Which is essentially what it was. Gordon almost smiled at that. It faded quickly. "The things I said about you," he said, "over the years, at Christmas, the assumptions I made." He stopped. I thought I was protecting Patricia. I told myself that for a long time, that I was looking out for my sister because her husband wasn't giving her the life she deserved. He paused. "The truth is I just needed to feel like the most significant person in the room. And you were quiet, and you drove that truck, and you made it very easy for me to do that." I let that sit. "I built something," he said. "I know that. I grew that company. But I grew it on a foundation I didn't know was there. And that changes the story considerably." "You built something real," I said. "I mean that. The workforce, the relationships, the operational culture your father started and you continued. I own the majority of that company, but I couldn't have run it the way you did. I don't have that skill. What you have is legitimate. It just didn't need to be the only thing that mattered." He nodded slowly. "Patricia tells me you're working with Carolyn now," I said, "on the legacy client accounts. 2 days a week." He looked up. "She's exceptional." "She is." He turned his mug in his hands. "I'd like to start again," he said. "I know I don't have any standing to ask for that, but I'd like to try." I told him that starting again required being honest about who we had both been, and that I thought we were doing that right now, and that seemed like the right place to begin. He left at 9 o'clock and shook my hand at the door. This time the handshake was different. Not softer, exactly. Just honest. In March, Tyler drove to Hamilton on a Saturday morning. Patricia and I were having breakfast when he knocked, and he came in and sat at the same kitchen table where Gordon had sat, and he looked around at our house the way his grandmother had looked at it in a different context long ago. But this time what he saw was something different. "This is," he said, looking at the bookshelves and the photographs and the back window that faces the yard. "This is actually really nice." Patricia laughed. "It's a home," she said. "We built it that way on purpose." Tyler apologized. He apologized the way young people apologize when they have thought about it seriously for a long time and have finally understood that thinking about it is not the same as saying it, and that saying it is not optional. He looked at me and he said that he had used me as proof of a story he needed to believe, and that the story was wrong, and that he was sorry for the specific things he had said and for the years of smaller things that had accumulated into them. I told him that I accepted his apology and that I wanted to ask him something. He said okay. I asked him what he actually wanted to do with his career, not what had been arranged for him or what the company needed or what made sense given the family name. What did he, Tyler, at 26, actually find interesting when nobody was watching? He thought about it for longer than I expected. Then he said he had always been interested in supply chain sustainability, reducing emissions in transportation logistics. He said it almost quietly, like it was something he had kept in a drawer. I told him that Carolyn Fitch had told me 3 weeks ago that the company's biggest exposure over the next decade was going to be regulatory pressure on supply chain emissions, and that she was looking for someone to lead a new initiative on it, and that I had not mentioned his name because I wanted it to be his idea first. He stared at me. "Talk to Carolyn," I said, "on your own terms, not because of who your grandfather was." He called Carolyn that Monday. I heard from Martin that the conversation lasted 2 hours. Spring came to Hamilton the way it always does, reluctantly, and then all at once. Patricia and I sat on the back porch one evening in late April with our tea, watching the yard come back. The foundation had just confirmed its first cohort of apprenticeship grants, 47 students across 9 trades programs in the region. Patricia had spent a week reading each application herself. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The years of staying quiet." I thought about that honestly, the way you think about questions from someone who has earned the right to a real answer. "I regret the 18 months before the meeting," I said. "The period when I knew it was building and I let it go further than I needed to. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but part of me wanted them to show their hand completely. And that's not something I'm proud of." She nodded. "The rest of it," I said, "the 24 years before that, I would do it the same way. Because the life we built in this house is real. The way you see me is real. And I needed that to belong to something that money didn't build." She leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder, and we sat there while the city went on around us, ordinary and entirely sufficient. My name is Robert Kerrigan. I am 64 years old. I drove a truck with a broken defroster for 3 winters because I was never trying to prove anything to anyone who needed expensive things to pay attention. I watched people look through me at family gatherings and business dinners for 28 years, and I let them. And I built something anyway in the silence they left me. Here is what I learned. The people who dismiss you because of what you drive or where you live or what your job title sounds like, they are not seeing you. They are seeing the story they need you to be. You do not have to argue with that story. You do not have to perform against it. You only have to know the difference between it and the truth. And be patient, because the truth does not require anyone's permission to exist. Stay quiet when quiet serves you. Stay honest when honesty is due, and never let someone hand you a check as a measure of your worth because they have already told you everything important about themselves by trying. The defroster works now. Patricia was right about that, as she has been about most things that mattered.